Today we're here to talk about the greenhouse gas metric from the industry one. We'll be going through the industry one. I'll be introducing to what we do, who we are, and then we'll go on to the greenhouse gas metric and some insights that we've gotten from them. Afterwards, we will be hearing about Cornell's work on the higher ground report, followed by a panel discussion and a Q&A, as well as closing remarks. Throughout the webinar, I would love to hear from you. So please feel free to use the chat and Q&A function to interact with one another, introduce yourselves, tell us where you are, but also throughout the webinar, please do let us know what your vision for the industry you would like to see is. So yeah, I would say let's get going. So the industry we want was born of impatience and frustration with the pace of change in the industry and a belief in its transformative potential. The industry we want is one that ensures dignity for workers in decent jobs, thriving businesses that give more than they take while safeguarding the planet. With this purpose in mind, the industry we want developed a set of industry-wide metrics to measure progress or the lack thereof on an annual basis and leverage action on living wages, greenhouse gas emissions, as well as purchasing practices. We don't do any of this by ourselves. The metrics are created in a collaboration with a number of partners, namely the three lead organizations, which are the Ethical Trading Initiative, Fairware, and Cascale, formerly known as the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, as well as our data partners, the Better Buying, Wage Indicator, Apparel Impact Institute, and Wordly. The dashboard synthesizes extensive wage data on 28 major garment-producing countries, feedback from more than 1,400 suppliers across 63 countries, and new estimates of sector emissions. The data for each of these metrics is updated on an annual basis, so we can gauge how the industry is progressing and support alignment, encourage information exchange, collaboration, as well as industry-wide transformation. This year's scores show a varied progress in the garment industry with improved scores in some areas and stagnations in others. But today we're here to talk about the greenhouse gas metric, so I'll dive a bit deeper into that one. And as I'm very, very sure everybody on this call knows and is very aware that the time to act on greenhouse gas and carbon emissions started years ago. We have pushed our natural systems to the breaking point, and as an industry, we are very, very much complicit. Based on the most recent data available from 2022 from Cascale Worldly Textile Exchange and AII, the estimate emissions for the garment sector are 0.879 gigatons of CO2 emissions. The material processing stage, or Tier 2, is the largest contributor, accounting for more than half of the industry's total emissions, compared to raw material production stage at 21%, the intermediate material processing at 15%, and finished product manufacturing at 9%. The data presented in the greenhouse gas metric shows a stagnating decrease in emissions. This is primarily due to efficiency improvements within the value chain being offset by a rise in material demand and an increase in fiber volumes, leading to higher production levels of apparel and footwear items. As a result, the sector's progress appears to have plateaued or shows minimal advancements. That being said, the metrics do not tell the whole story, and data alone will get us very far. In the last few years, we've seen the impacts of the climate crisis disproportionately borne by the world's most vulnerable populations, which includes regions that are crucial to our sector. To stay as close as possible to 1.5 trajectory needed to avoid climate disaster, the sector needs to achieve a 45% reduction by 2030 using a 2019 baseline year, and carbon neutrality by 2050. The 1% decrease between the first and third cycle of the greenhouse gas metric underlines that the industry is far from the progress needed to stay on track to do its part to limit global heating. While the industry should not stop doubling down on its mitigation initiatives, current efforts largely ignore the impacts of the climate crisis on the workers and their communities. To truly transform the industry at its core, it is imperative for stakeholders across the value chain to work towards a shared vision, to build trust amongst each other, and enable collective action. To make this happen, power needs to shift and systems need to change across the whole value chain. It's clear that this will require radical collaboration in the industry and perhaps beyond. This is only achievable when we share existing successful and scalable solutions, amplifying their reach and effectiveness, because only together we can all raise the bar and promote a level playing field in our industry. With today's panel, we will be focusing on the importance of increasing climate adaptation efforts across the value chain, the economic and human costs of inaction, as well as highlighting solutions that will get us closer to create the industry we want. But that's enough for me now. It is my utmost pleasure to introduce to you today's speakers. Firstly, we have Brian Wakamo. He is a research support specialist with the Global Labour Institute at the Cornell University ILR School. The Global Labour Institute of Cornell University published a Higher Ground Professional Climate Breakdown report last year, featuring groundbreaking research highlighting the widespread climate vulnerability from extreme heat and flooding of 32 apparel production hubs. And our second speaker today is Prakash Menakel. He is the Global Director of Strategy and Impact at Cotton Connect. In his role, Prakash drives key global initiatives in standards and partnerships, traceability and impact, central to Cotton Connect's mission of fostering environmental stewardship and social responsibility within the cotton industry. Brian, now I would love to hand over to you and for you to set the scene for today's discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hanna. Hi, everyone. As she said, I am Brian Wakamo. I work the Global Labor Institute as part of Cornell, which is part of the ILR school. As you can see, the name of Global Labor Institute of Cornell's Industrial and Labor Relations School is a bit of a mouthful, so we shorten that to just Cornell GLI. But we are a group, kind of a sub-research organization within the ILR school that is dedicated specifically to researching and writing about labor conditions in global supply chains. And we write a lot about the apparel sector because we have a lot of interest in that, but we also talk about and research other parts of the global supply chains because we believe this is such a hugely important issue, especially moving forward with due diligence laws and things like that coming into effect in the future. But one of our main driving principles is that we feel that a lot of regulatory regimes that we've seen recently, whether it is public from governments in the past couple of decades, or if it is private through multi-stakeholder initiatives or kind of other broader kind of corporate responsibility kind of agreements, have been insufficient. We have not seen a huge improvement in freedom of association or labor conditions across the board, across all industries, and we feel that's something that needs to change. And we hope that through our research and through our writing and through our work that we can spark new conversations. Previously, it was known as the New Conversations Project before we changed it to be the Global Labor Institute, with the idea of working with stakeholders across the board and across the world on these issues to try to brainstorm and create and find new solutions to deal with the issue of working conditions and labor across supply chains. You can go to the next slide. So as Hanna mentioned, last year we put out these two kind of major flagship reports called Higher Ground, which we broke down into two separate ones. One was focusing on the climate data and projections going into the future, which I'll talk about throughout this webinar today, and the other was going over climate resilience efforts and specific impacts on a series of brands that we had data for, and going through what their kind of exposure was to climate risk moving forward. Yeah, those are the two kind of sum total of our Higher Ground reports. You can, next slide, please. So we did this in association with the British kind of investment firm, Schroders, who helped kind of provide the economic analysis behind this in a lot of ways. And the main thing was to study heat and flooding in these major apparel production centers. And we go over 23 cities that are from Karachi and Delhi to Prato, Italy to San Salvador. It's all different locations around the world with different kind of maturities and different kind of how established their garment sectors and their different ways and how important they are as major centers. And the idea was to show using future climate projections just how big the threat was of climate change to the apparel industry around the world, mainly by looking at heat and flooding, to show how much at risk the populations were, how much hotter, how much higher flooding, all of these kinds of things was for these cities. And the big part of it was to show that mitigation is an important subject and something that needs to be done. We should try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and plenty of other kind of climate specific projects, but that there is a need for adaptations now. We are in a present and will be in a future in which temperatures are going to rise, flooding is going to become more common, and there are actions that need to be taken to deal with that fact and adapt to that to protect the industry and to protect the workers in there. And that was a big reason of why we did this report and what is inside the report. And a part of that is to try, and we run through this in the report and we'll talk about this throughout this webinar today, that we were hoping to inspire industry actors from brands, from suppliers, from governments to produce large-scale adaptation strategies, because this is not something that can be piecemeal from one factory to one factory. It has to be done on a kind of large scale, cross-national, cross-city, whatever you want to say, scale. And we want to see and the kind of final thing is we want to see these measures and costs included in the business plans of the fashion industry, because if it's just kind of a side idea or a side goal, that it's not going to have the kind of focus that it needs to have in order to really deal with this issue and this crisis confronting it. Next slide, please. So, like I said, we feel that fashion focuses its climate change efforts on the wrong topics and ideas, which is why I said mitigation. And it's a lot of it is through those things, which is recycling fabric, reducing water usage, cutting down greenhouse gas emissions, which again are really important and something that needs to be done. And something that, as Hanna showed, that is not being done at the same kind of level as we would hope. But it does not; those efforts do not take into affect how climate breakdown that is already here is already affecting workers and communities around the globe and the fashion industry. And we see that as a necessary change. And we see the fact that they haven't as a failure of the industry, and that it needs to prioritize adaptation, because that is the crisis that is coming at us day by day. And that if there is not adaptation, there is a high likelihood from the projections that were run for the report that there will be production drops in a lot of these apparel producing nations, that there will be export earnings lost, there will be jobs lost, things like that, which I will talk about in greater effect later in this webinar. But that is a big part of it. It's like, if you don't adapt, the nations will, and these industries will suffer economically because of the lack of adaptation. And then you can show the last slide real quick, which is, this is what we have projections. And again, that we'll have this up later, which is kind of a quick run of the cost of not adapting for these industries and these 4 nations, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Pakistan, and Vietnam, that we highlight. And I'll go into more detail about that later. But back to you.
Well, I'll stop sharing at this point and we can start the discussion now. So thank you so much, Brian. At this point, I would like for you, as you had already alerted to, deep dive a bit more into the data and tell us about what the data tells us about the direct impacts of the climate crisis on not just the value chain, but also its people.
Yeah, so we have a report from us at Cornell GLI coming out, hopefully, ideally next week, which is talking about, or it's Higher Ground is doing a lot of projections, but it's talking about the future, which is seeing what, based on very moderate climate projections and models, what is the future impact going to be? And we've thought for a follow-up that we wanted to see how bad has it already gotten. As you know, everyone knows the world is warming at an unsustainable rate, and we wanted to really try and measure how that has already kind of happened and how that's already affecting the industry. And in our report, out of those 23 cities that we highlighted in higher ground, 17 out of them have already seen an increase of at least 10% in the average annual amount of days that are over 35 degrees Celsius, which if there are any people who use Fahrenheit, that's 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is from the 2005-2009 period. We took averages from that 5-year period, and then from the 2020 and 2024 period. And it's already in most of these cities up at least 10%. Some have seen even more market increases. And we also focus specifically on the 5 cities in those focus nations. We focus on Karachi, Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh, Dhaka, and Phnom Penh, and we calculated wet bulb globe temperatures, which is a more complete kind of picture of heat stress because it includes humidity as part of it. And we found that there is a notable rise already in the number of days with the temperatures above 30.5 degrees Celsius on the wet bulb globe temperature scale. And we highlight that number of 30.5 because that is the threshold where you need 30 minutes of rest for every 30 minutes of work you do. That is kind of a threshold where you need to equal work for equal rest, because otherwise you are really risking heat stress at that point in time. And probably the most notable city out of it is across wet bulb and across dry bulb temperatures, which are the 35 degrees, which is the normal thermometers that we all use, is Karachi. They are one that has already seen a huge amount of impacts from climate change, and it's one where it's really at risk and is really vulnerable, especially from heat and humidity kind of accelerating. But we also followed up on flooding, and there's not a perfect analog. We use rainfall, which is obviously a huge part of flooding, but it's not, flooding is very variable from block to block, city to city, day to day. But we have noticed that in 10 out of the 23 cities, there's been at least a 10% increase in average rainfall on the rainiest days in the year from that 2005 to 2009 period to the 2020 to 2024 period, showing that we knew it was bad. But this is really how bad it's already gotten in a lot of these places. And as part of that, we've tracked events of heat and flooding impacting the garment industry, or even just the nation and these cities on the whole. And we've seen in places like Bangladesh, India, and Cambodia, where garment workers have been dealing with immense amounts of heat stress or other heat-related illnesses, or have dealt with flooding as part of the jobs that have stopped the industry. One really notable thing is in Bangladesh. There's been obviously a huge amount of floods this year, and part of that included ones that shut down the port of Chattogram, which is a huge part of the export industry and kind of infrastructure in the nation, which is heavily reliant on that. But it's not a very uplifting kind of story or conclusion, but we wrote in higher ground it's going to get worse in the future. And with this upcoming report, we have studied and found that it's already getting pretty bad. So that's a dour note to leave it on here, but that's what we found.
Thanks so much for presenting the data a bit more in depth. Prakash, you and your organization work with communities located in countries that are disproportionately affected by global heating. Especially, you've experienced and your community has experienced a lot of flooding in recent years, highlighting the floods in Pakistan in 2022. But you've also implemented work and programs because of that. Can you tell us a bit about how your community and the farmers that you work with were affected and what you've done in the result of it?
Sure, Hanna. I represent Cotton Connect. We are a pioneering organization which is helping to reimagine the future for supply chains. We started back in 2013, trained more than 800,000 smallholder farmers in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and a few other geographies. And having worked with more than 25 textile brands, we are focusing on addressing environmental issues, climate change mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable livelihoods and gender empowerment. The effects of climate change on farming communities in the regions we work have been profound, posing immense, challenges to livelihoods of the farmers. The environmental conditions is always a key deciding factor for success of any farming program. For example, in Pakistan instance, the summer floods in 2022 caused a death toll of over 1,500 people and damages of an estimated about 30 billion to US dollars. The estimates by government of Pakistan, it is 40% of the annual cotton crop has been affected due to the 2022 floods. So coming to our projects in Pakistan, our project areas in Pakistan were hit by the hill torrents and the flooding from rivers. Loss of topsoil was a major setback for the farmers because they have been doing sustainable practices and preparing that soil and getting out of the land degradation issues. And water logging in some of these areas also impacted the mitigation. Many farmers lost their livestock, which is one of the income sources for most of these farmers. And post-flood soil test results show that there was more than 50% reduction in the soil organic matter and other soil nutrients than in the pre-flood conditions. While many suffered complete crop loss, overall we witnessed approximately 50% crop loss during that season. Even in our project areas in Gujarat, India, the Biparjoy cyclone that happened in June 2023 was a severe cyclone, adversely affected our farmers. Many project districts were affected, and the biggest impact was seen in the Kutch and Patan districts. The cyclone affected the harvested and also the cultivated crops, adversely affected the households in this region. And in this Bangladesh prolonged rains, the current season, farming season paved way for crop loss and damage, immense damage, because due to untimely and extensive rainy spells resulted in approximately 15% reduction in the yields. Looking ahead, prolonged heat waves and hot weather are also shortened the cotton production. Rising temperatures and erratic rainfall lead to reduced yields and soil degradation and increased pest pressures. By the cotton 2040 in a report says that by 2040, 40% of the cotton producing regions are likely to see their growing season shortened because of rising heat. And we did our research where we published our Women in Cotton report focusing on the impact of climate change in women farmers. We found that climate change is creating some additional challenges for women farmers in particular. Women farmers have to work longer hours in the farm due to climate change and due to sowing failures. Resowing is also required at times, in turn requiring them to spend more hours than usual. Sudden excessive rainfall can erode the topsoil, and long dry spells, dry out the sowing seeds and requiring another round of sowing. And as I mentioned in the Pakistan flood, and due to the changing climate and the related aspects, they need to spend more time caring for their livestock. And the immense rainfall is also affecting the biodiversity in this region, and availability of just affecting the fodder availability for the farmers. And also at their household levels, women need to spend more time taking care of the chores at house, parallelly working on the farms. And as the summers are more drier now, they need to find more time to fetch water from the water sources. And they also explained that they could previously prepare food in advance. Now because of the heat spells, the food also is getting affected, so they need to cook multiple times. So these are all affecting the overall our farmers. And to sum up, the impact of climate change has caused reduced income, increased times and effort required on farm, and affecting the health and well-being of the farmers that we are working with.
Thank you for that, and especially also highlighting the disproportionate impact on the women that you work with. Now that we've already talked about the massive impact that this is already having, before we get to any solutions, we unfortunately need to keep a bit in the doom and gloom, and because that's just the reality of the situation right now. So Brian, you've talked about also future projections of and the cost and danger of inaction within our industry. Could you dive a bit deeper into that and tell us also what it means in terms of economic, but also human costs if we fail to adapt to global heating?
Yeah, of course. So I'll start by going a little more in depth about the climate projections, which we've talked about and which we did for the report. And again, it's not surprising to hear that things are gonna be worse. That in the higher ground reports, we also calculated and projected out wet bulb globe temperatures for those 23 cities moving into the future. And we see that in some of these places, and specifically in those 5 kind of highlighted cities, Karachi, Dhaka, Ho Chi Minh, Phnom Penh, Hanoi, that the average number of days that are above that 30.5 Celsius wet bulb globe temperature day, it's going to be 50% higher, basically moving forward as we get towards 2050. So we have climate projection. We did projections up to 2030 and 2050 for all of this. And a big part of it also, and what you're seeing on screen right now, are these maps of flooding projections, which we have as both coastal and riverine. And coastal flooding is kind of obvious. It's tidal flooding primarily, or storm surge. And you have kind of riverine, which is a mix of river and rainfall flooding as kind of a joint measure of 2 of those, because they're obviously 2 different things, but they're influenced with each other. And this is for Dhaka and Chittagong, basically the darker the color is basically the worse the flooding is going to get, is the higher levels it's going to get. And this is moving forward 2050 projections. And it's basically, this is trying to show the exposure that factories, those dots are all factories in the area, have to higher levels of flooding as seen from this kind of climate change feature. It's a big part of also the research is also talking about what are the kind of economic and human costs of this climate change feature that we're seeing, and the kind of higher flooding and higher heat levels that we're seeing. And first of all, like, there's the very basic is that across the board, higher heat and obviously higher flooding impact days cause just lower production levels across the board. There's a conservative estimate that basically for every 1% that the temperature goes, or the 1 degree that the temperature goes above 25 degrees Celsius in the wet bulb globe temperature scale, that productivity decreases by an average of 1.5%. And that just kind of keeps going more and more as we see these go higher. So that is obviously the first immediate impact, is that production is going to be lower, and that has knock-on effects, which is that one piece of estimation that we did is that so the 4 countries, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Pakistan, and Vietnam, that are 18% of global apparel exports, risk losing 65 billion in export earnings in 2030, which would be a 22% decline, and risk losing 1 million jobs if they do not have a climate adaptive future and try and implement adaptation impacts. And 2050 is, unsurprisingly, if they do not adapt, is even more kind of stark. There we have about a 68.8 or so, 60 to 69% lower earnings for a non-climate adaptive scenario, and about 34.5% drop in employment, which would be 8.64 or so million fewer jobs. And that would be a huge loss for all of these nations economically. And when combined with productivity drops that we see, could be about 5% of brands' net operating profits after tax because of high heat and flooding. This is something that really needs to be taken into account, that you need a climate adaptive future needs to be taken into consideration. But of course, it's not all just economic impacts. This has a, high heat and flooding has a huge impact on the human beings who are actually working in these factories. There are a ton of health issues that come with higher heat levels, especially in indoor working environments where it can get hotter and hotter than it is on the outside. So generalized heat stress, but obviously there are specific parts of that. You have headaches, you have dehydration. There's a huge bulk of research shown that when it is hot, both in the day and at night, you have a much lower chance of having a good night's sleep, and you have much less restful and solid sleep. You have fainting, you have even more severe impacts of heat stroke, so that can obviously lead to hospital stays, or it can sadly lead to death. And you also, with floods, especially if they become a chronic issue, can both be an irritant in the sense of like crossing the street and getting to work and stopping from that day. But there are also, if you have to go through floodwaters, you have to deal with things like rashes or dengue, or you can deal with diarrhea from the kind of dealing with floodwaters. And that means, again, high medical costs, lower productivity, lost income for both the workers and for these factories. And one thing I want to also highlight is that with things like the CSDDD and CSRD coming from the European Union and corporate due diligence laws, if you are a lead firm and your suppliers are not taking into account or not providing a safer work environment, this is a place of possible liability. I mean, we don't know how anything is exactly going to shake out as things move forward, but it is something to take into account that if this is seen to be a liability in your supply chain from these laws, whether it is because of poor working conditions, that is a liability for companies, and that's something that needs to take into account as we think about prioritizing adaptation measures for suppliers and for the industry.
Thank you for that, Brian. Prakash, now on to you. How will it also seeing that you've in the past experienced these extreme floodings within your organizations and the communities you work in, how do you foresee the risk of inaction in terms of climate adaptation to be in the regions that you work with, and the livelihoods of the farmers in the next few years?
See, Hanna, the risk of inaction in climate adaptation for cotton farmers can be significant. Firstly, without the right interventions, climate, extremes like prolonged droughts, rainfall, and floods will severely damage the crop, reducing the yields and driving farmers into poorer health and, worse financial situations. And lower productivity resulting from all these translates into reduced income for the farmers, making it harder for them to invest into inputs like seeds, fertilizers, and water efficient technologies, creating a diminished resilience for them. Secondly, it increases aspects such as soil erosion, salinization, and loss of fertility, especially in areas prone to flooding or intense droughts. And poor soil health also reduces the land's ability to sustain cotton farming, forcing farmers into either abandon their fields or rely on costly external inputs, further eroding their profitability and land degradation. And then inaction on adoption measures like promoting crop diversity and maintaining natural ecosystem leads to reduced biodiversity, making farmers farming system less reliant to the external shocks. So at Cotton Connect, we have been engaging farmers and encouraging climate adaptation through practices like regenerative farming. The regenerative agriculture for us is crucial because it allows farmers to be more resilient to the changes in our environment and enable them to farm in a way that reduces the harmful risk on and impacts on cotton farming. We introduced our Real Regenerative Code of Conduct in 2021 to enhance the agro biodiversity, soil health, and climate adaptation. And we did a pilot in starting 2020-23 with 350 farmers in Narmada districts of Gujarat. It covered various aspects such as how to boost the biodiversity, regenerate the soil, especially the topsoil, conserving water, and promoting intercropping. We also taught them on locally relevant practices and regenerative practices such as vermicomposting, creating generating biochar to nourish their land, and introduced ideas such as growing sorghum grain alongside their crops, which will attract birds so that the birds will come and pick the pests, so that reducing the need for spraying of the pesticides. So while we foresee the consequences of inaction around climate adaptation being severe, we are also positive that more farmers can be supported to benefit from proactive practices such as regenerative farming through training and awareness generation programs.
Wonderful. Sounds like you're already doing a lot, and that perfectly leads me into the next section of this panel. Both of you, so Brian and Prakash, you have both extensively outlined why climate adaptation is crucial. Luckily, as you've already hinted to, Prakash, there are some solutions out there that the industry can work on and implement. Can you go a bit deeper into the initiatives, for example, the climate ambassadors that you're working with, but also what you've already mentioned, the programs on soil health, biodiversity, and the pilot program that you're currently running?
See, Just to go back a bit on the Pakistan floods, how we address that, in order to support them. The normal way of responding to a disaster is to work along with relief agencies. Like, in our project areas, we are well connected to the farmers through direct linkages and through our local partners. And we know our supply chain very well. So we were able to respond immediately and quickly through our own, mechanism in these emergencies. Following that, the floods in Pakistan, we work with our local partners to provide relief and aid, aid materials and helping them to reconstruct, the systems that are prevailing in the communities. We also conducted soil tests to see what extent the soil has been affected based on the test advised to farmers on the nutrient requirements in the soil. Similarly, we also did a lot of interventions in, Gujarat and our affected areas in Bangladesh. So the lessons learned, from these experience helped us to initiate, as I mentioned, the Real Regenerative Program is to address the climate change and mitigate, the issues resulting from that. And under the Real Regenerative Program, we launched a climate change ambassadors program. Under the project, we identified trained women farmers to act as climate leaders in their community, equipping them with the right knowledge and knowledge about climate change, and and taking them through and making them educate the fellow farmers about the need for climate change mitigation measures and adaptation, as it requires a behavior change and practice changes. We trained a group of approximately 40 women farmers in this community as a pilot, and there they in turn trained 30 women farmers in their community. So we generated a cadre of trained about a cadre of 1,200 individuals in that community. And we are now in the process of scaling up these initiatives to our other project areas. And also in 2023, we launched the first Responsible Genes Code of Conduct with a focus on reduction in GHG emissions and promoting a safe working environment for the workers at the processor levels. We are in the second phase of the pilot, where we are working with selected genes across multiple countries, supporting them, strengthening their environment, social and governance aspect, ensuring a healthy and safe work environment, and supporting their transition into renewable energy sources and better practices, and also reducing their emissions and identification through emission hotspots. And we are also supporting the workers at the farm level, and we expect this work to continue to other communities in the future, and also continually working at new ways to support our farmers to increase their resilience.
Wonderful. That sounds like really inspiring work. And I'd love to hear more at some point. But Brian, also in the reports, you outline several higher ground approaches that the industry could adapt to mitigate all those consequences that we've talked about earlier. I believe they range from green factory initiatives, but also, in essence, human resources initiatives. Could you walk us through them a bit?
Yeah. So yeah, we list a wide variety of different kind of adaptation strategies, and I'll try to run through it at different kind of levels. And I'll start at what I consider to be the highest level here, which is a governmental level. And obviously there's a lot that a government can do. And there are a few things that we said that they should do in mandate, which is one, that they should integrate climate adaptation and worker rights related factors into trade policies is a big thing. Obviously, they're very reliant on this as a major trade industry in the nation, and we feel that there should be things that should be prioritized within those policies. Another thing they need to do is treat these heat and flooding events as the huge major hazards they are, and mandate paid leave for heat and flooding related impacts across the board. We also think they need to implement regulations on safe working practices and environments in the factories. We have a rundown across a few different nations, from Vietnam to Pakistan to Malaysia and other parts of the industry, where we're running down national policies on the environment within these factories, primarily around temperature, but also around water access, things like that. And it's very inconsistent. Not every nation has a temperature threshold, for that matter, but not even some of them specify, the level of safe working environment and things like that. So we think that there needs to be a large scale kind of implementation of regulations to mandate that, as well as also adding additional social protection mechanisms to protect livelihoods for workers, so expanding access to things like that across these nations, and implementing financing measures in the nation to help pay for adaptation and resiliency efforts in these factories in their country. So for brands and employers, some of those also and suppliers, some of those also apply. I've also looked through corporate kind of codes of conduct and things like that, and not all brands, suppliers, and employers have temperature standards or kind of temperature reporting mechanisms as part of that. And that's something that we also believe that brands need to implement as part of these kind of adaptation things. Make sure that there are safe working environments across the board in your factories, that they are not these kinds of ovens that are just overheating the workers constantly. Do things like change work hours or effort levels and rest periods and hydration standards around set temperature standards, like establish those as part of it. But also there is, of course, physical kind of parts of this infrastructural related things, which is adding cooling. It sounds kind of obvious, but add cooling systems and change the electrical systems to make it more efficient. Switch to LED light bulbs, things like that, that provide, that put off less heat in these environments. Build flood barriers and flood doors and flood ventilation and drainage systems, all of which obviously have a cost to them. But the research we have done, and as we mentioned in the report, that there is a return on investment on those, and it might be a high kind of initial outlay, but there is a way that you can claw back the cost of this through higher productivity, through lack of working days lost, through ability to better adapt to these kind of changing situations. And also, as part of it is obviously there's a lot of discussion in the industry about green factories, and we wanted to touch on that because green factories both is kind of a meaningless thing in the sense that it can mean whatever you want it to be. There's no set thing of what is a green factory. And we wanted to look through that, obviously, which can be a wide variety of stuff. It can be either new factories or factory retrofits to make it LEED certified or whatever you want to say, but it can also be more efficient passive and cooling systems. And we saw that in those instances that even if it's not specifically targeted to kind of dealing with adaptation for heat and flooding, that these can also, in a lot of cases, they're just more efficient, cooler, better working environments. And we estimated that you can claw back, 28.5% or so of the cost of these kind of adaptations through and also as well as the export earnings lost through a non-adaptive scenario by implementing these kind of green factory reforms as well as these other adaptation standards. One thing that we also we stress in the report is that there is going to be a temptation for brands and retailers to shift away from these kind of climate vulnerable centers. Obviously, a lot of these nations, I know Pakistan is one of the, I think in many ranked one of the top 10, top 5 most climate vulnerable nations. Bangladesh is obviously hugely vulnerable to climate change. And we want to caution and stress that the kind of idea of cutting and running to other parts of the world in which there might be lower climate risks is not a great idea, both because it's a huge kind of cost and change in that regard, but also, as the research shows, this is not just a phenomenon exclusive to Southeast Asia or that part of the world, and it's going to affect everywhere, as well as the fact that they are in a lot of ways going to struggle to build the same kind of large scale capacity that they already have in that part of in South and Southeast Asia specifically. And lastly, we touch on investors, which is that they need to work to engage with apparel companies and their stakeholders to encourage adoption of adaptation measures, because at the point in time, as I mentioned, the focus is very much so on mitigation, but moving forward, it needs to be an adaptation, and investors in these companies and these firms need to specifically prioritize adaptation as part of that. But when all things are considered, we saw that the return on investment for the most part is really strong on implementing these things and helps claw back or prevent, in a lot of cases, these losses to employment and to apparel export earnings if they're implemented in a timely manner.
Well, it sounds like all of us, but also the entire industry and other stakeholders have their work cut out for themselves. But luckily, there seem to be a number of solutions, and with that, hope that we can still act and hopefully limit the effects on our supply chain and the communities within it, and each worker that would be affected as much as we can. But before I go to the questions, and by the way, Daniela, I saw your hand up. If you could put your question in the Q&A box and I will get to it. Before we do that though, I would like to hear from both of you what the industry you would want to see in 5, 10, 15 years looks like. Brian, let's start with you.
Yeah, I would like to see an industry that is cognizant and takes into effect the impact of all of this on the workers, and having that at the forefront of their minds, because they are the ones who are doing the production, doing the work, and the ones who are most at risk from a lot of this. But also an industry in which it is understanding and is adequately juggling both mitigation and adaptation efforts as ways to both reduce climate emissions and greenhouse gases, but it's also one that is doing what it can to protect the people who are within those buildings and within the industry on the whole in these nations and in these cities.
Thank you. Prakash, over to you. What's the industry you would like to see?
For me, I would like to be the farmers' voices and the processors' voices here, where I envision a future where farmers possess the necessary knowledge, tools, and resources to effectively, address the climate change issues, and which could be achieved by ensuring, diversified income streams and creating resilience to environmental and economic shocks, and ensuring sustainable livelihoods for the farmers and their communities. At the same time, the processors in the supply chain, to take proactive measures to address their emissions and need for worker welfare by developing, implementing robust ESG action plans. Importantly, the costs associated with these need to be equitably shared across the supply chain, fostering a sense of collective responsibility rather than being perceived as a financial burden. These efforts should be perceived as an essential investment to safeguard the planet and the people, and us doing the right thing today for a sustainable and a prosperous future.
That sounds like a great industry on both sides. I hope that we'll get there one day. But now to the Q&A. We have a few questions that come in. Let's start with Amel, your question. How would you see the change in apparel industry business models to address climate change issues? Open to the panel. Who would like to answer that specifically? Also happy to repeat the questions if needed.
Yeah, maybe I can start. And in the recent days, due to the legislations and the evolving legislation scenario, there's an increased interest into looking into the emissions and claims that there's an evolving claims agenda. So all these are paving way for the industry partners are looking really into the data that they are creating and the interventions that they are doing, and how they are actually addressing the climate change and the claims they are making in the public in terms of sustainability and regenerative or the farming or the processor related claims. So I see there is a bright future, and investments are being made and the small steps are contributing towards a greater change. And there is a lot of focus on the health and safety aspects at the worker levels and the worker welfare. So we see a lot of changes and interest among the industry partners in our programs, and a lot of approaches are being made to us to take up programs such as social programs and programs aiming at looking at the labor aspects and looking at the addressing the climate change and looking at nature-based solutions. So I see there is a lot of initiatives are being taken, but still it is a long way to go, and a lot of changes have to be made because we lost a lot of time in the past, so we need to make up that for the future.
Right, Brian, there's a question directed at you. So Chala is wondering if you've done any research also into other industry and how the apparel industry compares to other industries in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in the value chain, but also I imagine the effects of heat and flooding. And then also we've touched upon it a bit in the last section, but what are sort of like the lowest hanging fruits to reduce those impacts, and what can the industry do?
Yeah, so if I'm not mistaken, I know that the apparel industry globally is second or third, something like that, in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions throughout the entire industry. I mean, that is obviously a huge, massive number, and one that is part of why we're all here. Is why we're talking about is because it contributes in many ways to the emissions problem that we're dealing with greenhouse gases across the world. In terms of I haven't done, and we at Cornell have not done a lot of specific comparative research in the sense of seeing how it deals with or is compared to, say, agriculture or things like that. Though I know they all share a lot of the same kind of issues in terms of, or a lot of the same kind of problems, which is obviously a huge part of what causes these high levels of emissions is transportation, is plainly just transporting goods across the world. That is a huge part of it, as well as Prakash will know this better, is the broader kind of issues that comes with emissions through different farming practices and the ways in which that needs to be done. And I'm very glad and excited to hear the way that Prakash and his team are working on ways to better sustainably farm. As to regards to easiest opportunities, there aren't really kind of any specific lowest hanging fruit other in the way that could have a huge meaningful impact, other than I know that you see this in some parts, and especially in Europe, where there's kind of like nearshoring efforts and moving production closer to where the final destination is going to be. That is one way in which you can reduce transportation emissions. And obviously there are things that are the smallest scale, which is finding ways to use renewable energies in the factories, things like that, which is obviously, again, things we should all do, but that aren't going to have the same kind of necessarily impact, but are still important. And I think those kind of mitigation, like local mitigation as well as adaptation efforts, are probably the easiest opportunities in that regard.
Wonderful. Well, we have another question in the chat as well from Spencer. I'm just going to read it out loud real quick. With the apparel industry responsible for up to 10% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, third behind fossil fuel and agriculture, it seems that worrying about impacts of climate change on the industry's earning and employment is at best incomplete. The garment supply chain is largely responsible for the climate change impacts on itself. Shouldn't the focus be on reducing consumption outputs from the industry and reducing the environmental impacts all along the supply chain? So it's more around a focus on production and consumption reduction. Anybody would like to take this one?
I can jump in. Yeah, you are correct that you could point the kind of the finger on, I guess, on us, so to speak, which is we buy a lot of clothes, and there's obviously the increase in fast fashion industries is a huge driver of this. They turn over product incredibly quickly using pretty unsustainable methods, both in terms of its effect on the workers, but also on how they deal with the actual fabric and materials. And that is a huge issue, and one that I think there's a lot of smart people talking about and working on. One thing I will say is that is not a great and easy sell for the industry, which is to try to, these are to say basically to accept selling less, is one that a lot of brands and manufacturers and suppliers are not going to want to hear. And that's one that I don't know if necessarily is something that can be done on a broader level, on a broader societal or global level, is to say to people to stop consuming as much and instead focusing on the ways in which that we can adapt and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate these kinds of issues. Something that is a way that we can reduce the environmental impacts as we try to grapple with broader societal questions about, do we buy too many clothes? That is one that is a much more difficult question to answer, whereas these kind of efforts of mitigation and adaptation are ones that we have more solid answers to, and as well as we have more quantifiable economic studies on the impacts of how it could affect both the workers, but also the industries on the whole.
So we've touched upon a lot of exciting research and resources throughout this talk. I've linked them here. You can't actually click on them now, but we'll make sure for them to be sent to you in a follow-up email. There's really exciting work from Cotton Connect, the Power Impact Institute, and Cornell on, for example, women in cotton, which Prakash touched upon, but also the 2 higher ground reports, as well as watch out for the next report coming up next week, hopefully. And the greenhouse gas metric is based on Apparel Impact Institute taking stock of progress against the roadmap to net zero 2024. This report is updated on an annual basis. So we also watch out for that next year. So there will be a new report. Next to that, some shameless self-promotion. There is a deep dive on wages. It will be the last one this year, coming up on the 11th of December at 11 to 12 mainland Europe time. We'd love to see many of you return there. And then if you have any more questions, or any questions pop up in the follow-up to this, please feel free to reach out to the Industry One. Here's our website, our email. Also follow us if you'd like to. Let me quickly check. Yeah, so all the resources are also currently being linked in the chat. So feel free to click on them and already save them in your reading list. And that will have been it from us. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this, spending an hour with us and listening to Brian and Prakash sharing their wonderful insights on the current state of the industry and adaptation. And I urge you all to get in touch with them if you have any more questions. And also, as said, read up on the resources that we will be sharing with you. So yeah, if there's nothing else, thanks again. It was wonderful having you both, Brian and Prakash. A big thank you, but also thank you to the Industry One team who behind the scenes have made sure that all of this runs smoothly. So Sophie, Omari, and Sophie, thank you so much for everything, and hope to see you guys soon. Stay in touch, and yeah, have a wonderful rest of the day and week.